On June 21, 1941, school graduations took place throughout the Soviet Union. The waltzes of the brass bands echoed through the air. Yesterday's 10th graders, their teachers, and their parents enjoyed late-night parties and went out to greet the dawn. However, within a few hours, they were faced with shocking news. The Wehrmacht received the code signal, Dortmund, confirming the launch of Operation Barbarossa on the morning of June 22. A gigantic mass of infantry, tanks, tractors and cars moved towards the Soviet border. At the same time from Moscow begins transmitting Directive No. 1, according to which it was ordered to put troops on alert and covertly occupy firing points in fortified areas. But at the last moment the Kremlin decides to add a phrase to it: do not succumb to any provocative actions. In fact, it was not possible to get the directive to the military units in time before the start of hostilities. The day before, German saboteurs disrupted the wired communication lines of the headquarters of the border armies with the Western District, as a result of which the measures indicated in it were not carried out. The commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, Heinz Guderian, noted in his diary, "Careful observation of the Russians convinced me that they did not suspect anything about our intentions. In the courtyard of the fortress in Brest, to the sound of an orchestra, they conducted a separation of the guards. The coastal fortifications along the western Bug were not occupied by troops. Towards the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the Brest Fortress, built a century earlier, has lost its strategic importance in the eyes of the military. It was used as a barracks and ammunition depot. The fortress was occupied by 2 Soviet divisions, border guards and other units that were supposed to defend the fortress in case of war. The assault on the fortress was carried out by the 45th Infantry Division under the command of Major General Fritz Schlieper. It was formed in Austria, the birthplace of Hitler, and was considered the elite of the Wehrmacht. It was the soldiers of this division who were the first to enter Paris, and they won in Holland and Belgium. It took Hitler only 8 hours to storm the fortifications. The German command did not have accurate information about the number of Soviet troops in the fortress and relied on surprise attacks. A short but powerful artillery strike was planned to capture it. An impressive artillery group was attached to the Schlieper division, which included 200 mm self-propelled Karl mortars, 33,211 mm mortars and 50 multiple rocket launchers. The guns on the left bank of the Bug River were positioned in such a way that the blows fell immediately over the entire territory of the fortress and hit as many of its defenders as possible. At 3:50 a.m. on June 22, German assault groups captured all 6 bridges over the western Bug River in the area. Brest, after which the advanced units of the 45th Division began to move across bridges and on boats close to the fortress fortifications. At 4 a.m., German artillery began a massive artillery bombardment of the eastern outskirts of the city Brest. After 15 minutes, the fire was moved to the fortress and the northern town. Under enemy fire, everything that was outside the protection of the fortress walls was crushed. Almost all artillery and vehicles parked in open parks were destroyed. The water supply is damaged. The connection is broken. By the end of the half-hour bombardment, the casualties were already in the hundreds. Many died in their sleep, while in barracks and apartment buildings. Commander of the 4th Field Army of the Wehrmacht, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge believed that now all that remained was to finish off the demoralized defenders. At 4:20 a.m., the battalions of the 45th Infantry Division begin to land on the southern and northern islands of the fortress. The Volin fortification, also known as the Southern Island, is easily captured by German units on the move. A hospital had been set up here because there were no other barracks. The wounded soldiers were barely being transported to safety. The Germans, with grenades at the ready, looked into the basement and then continued their pursuit. They passed through the Terraspal gate and entered the citadel. As expected, there was no resistance on the central island. The attackers split into 3 groups. One group occupied the church, which had previously served as the regimental club and dining hall for the 33rd Regiment. The second one runs to the 3-arched gate and then to the North Island. The third one goes east along the building of the Ring Barracks. It creates a false impression that the fortress has been taken. The commanders of the German battalions gathered for a meeting to discuss further actions. Meanwhile, in the building of the barracks of the 333rd Regiment and the Engineering Department, the soldiers of Commissar Ifam Fahman, one of the few representatives of the command staff, who the war finds next to his subordinates, are on the defensive. From the windows of the barracks, Soviet soldiers open machine gun fire on a cluster of Germans near the club building and launch a counterattack, which, on Fomin's orders, was led by Komsomol member Samvel Matavasian. The Germans, who are being chased on their heels, run away in panic. Commander of the 45th Infantry Division Schleiper noted in his report, "It soon became clear that the Russians were fighting fiercely in the rear of our advanced units, shooting from windows, attics and basements and causing great damage to our officers and ultra-Orthodox. Contrary to all plans, positional battles are starting on the central island. The German commanders, who are blocked in the club and in the canteen, are calling for help by radio. Commander of the 3rd Battalion Gochtman Praxa and his battery commander were killed. The reinforcements called in moved extremely slowly. The Germans had to fight to overcome literally every meter of the territory. One by one, Wehrmacht officers were killed by sniper bullets. The Red Army soldiers, recovering from the shock of the first minutes, sheltered the wounded women and children in the basements and began to build defenses of the most dangerous areas. However, the surprise of the attack led to the fact that the garrison, deprived of a unified command, was divided into several pockets of resistance. The group of Captain Zubashev and Commissar Fomin defended themselves in the barracks of the 33rd Regiment. In the area the Tiraspol Gate, in the basements of the officer's house, was defended by detachments under the command of a senior Lieutenant Potapova and the border guards of the 9th Outpost of Lieutenant Kizhevatova. According to the pre-war deployment plan, in case of an alarm, the garrison had to leave the fortress at pre-agreed assembly points. But the sudden attack of the enemy was not taken into account by the plan. Under artillery fire, the organized exit turns into a panic. In the first hours, before the Germans closed the ring, about 4,000 people managed to escape from the fortress. Most of them would be captured or killed in the vicinity of Brest. By around 9 a.m., the fortress was completely blockaded, and the remaining defenders had no place to go. At the same time, on the northern island, Major Gavrilov, the commander of the 44th Rifle Regiment, led a group of soldiers from various units and attempted to reach his regiment's headquarters in the citadel. But the headquarters was already on fire, and he and his group of soldiers were running back, trying to get out of the fortress. But it was too late. The Germans had already taken over the northern gate. Unable to organize a defense at the gate itself, the major is forced to retreat to the nearest shelter, which happens to be the eastern fort. Hundreds of soldiers and officers have already gathered there. Without hesitation, Gavrilov forms a detachment from them and orders them to take up positions. The eastern fort was built using standard 19th-century technology. In fact, it doesn't have any walls. The massive horseshoe-shaped casemates are dug into the earthen rampart. Essentially, the enemy had no place to aim their guns. Gavrilov has a quadruple anti-aircraft machine gun and several 45mm cannons at his disposal. Gavrilov orders Lieutenant Zelpakharov, the commander of one of the companies, to set up a firing point on the second floor of the inner barracks. For the next 5 days, the eastern fort will be fighting for the entire eastern front. It's already falling Minsk, and the squad Gavrilova will still defend herself. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 self-propelled assault guns enter the fortress. One of them breaks into the citadel and hits the windows with direct fire. But it doesn't have much effect. The Soviet troops, having assembled the surviving armored vehicles and floating T-38 tanks, again try to counterattack and break out of the fortress, but run into the fire of German self-propelled guns. The stubborn resistance of the Soviet troops forces the commander of the 45th Division, General give the order for the Schleiper to withdraw. During the first day of fighting, his division suffered unprecedented losses. Only 21 officers and 290 soldiers and non-commissioned officers were killed, almost as many as during the 6 weeks of the French campaign. General of Artillery Brandt was instructed to investigate the division's actions. As a result, it was concluded that heavy rocket-propelled mortars and 211mm mortars were not capable of destroying basements and shelters of the fortress. By the end of the day, the fighting finally subsided. German troops were withdrawn to the outer ramparts of the fortress. On the night of June 22–23, the most effective breakthrough in all the days of defense was made. 2,000 men from the garrison of the western fort broke through the weak German barrier and successfully escaped from the fortress. Towards the morning of June 23, the German artillery opened fire again. The fortress is being hit by the latest German weapon, the Karl self-propelled mortar. Explosions of 2-ton shells destroy the towers of the Terraspol gate with unprecedented force. The White Palace is pierced from roof to ground, the citadel is shaken. In moments of calm, German vehicles with loudspeakers called on the garrison to surrender. About 2,000 people surrendered in the western part of the citadel and on the northern island. Among the defectors were many so-called Westerners. In the Brest Fortress, Westerners were called conscripts from Western Belarus who fiercely hated the Soviet government. Back in late September 1939, according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Brest and the Brest Fortress were ceded to the Soviet Union as a result of the partition of Poland. In the same year, the Brest Regional Committee issued a decree on the nationalization of industry and all private enterprises. In the two pre-war years, 10% of the population of Western Belarus was repressed. As a result, during interrogations, the defectors willingly told the Germans about the plans of the defenders and the positions of the commanders. Meanwhile, by noon on June 23, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group had bypassed Brest, crossed the bridges over the Western Bug River and reached the Warsaw Highway. Then it was blocked. The Brest Fortress actually lost its operational importance and no longer interfered with the general offensive. After the mass surrender the day before, only 2,000 soldiers remain in the besieged fortress. They will step into the legend of the immortal garrison. At this time, Famine's thinned squad moves slightly north to the barracks of the 33rd Regiment. The Germans have been sitting in the dining rooms since yesterday morning, shelling the courtyard. But by the evening the problem is solved. The Red Army soldiers attack from the top floor and throw grenades at the Germans. On the second night, it becomes clear to the defenders that the front has gone far and there will be no help. Attempts to contact the command were unsuccessful. Only German is heard on all the waves. But there are also much more pressing issues. The shock goes away after 2 days, and people realize that they haven't eaten anything during that time. To make matters worse, the defenders have nothing to drink. German machine guns are installed along the banks of rivers and canals. They pay with their lives for the besieged's attempts to reach the water. On the third day, Gavrilov and Fomin decide to send the women and children into captivity. Taking white flags, they go outside and head for the exits from the fortress. The Germans did not shoot and watched them from the earthen ramparts. From this moment on, the besieged begin their furious and unsuccessful attempts to break out of the fortress. Attacks follow both at night and during the day, in different directions. But the maximum that comes out is to swim across the river and run a few hundred meters. Most of them die. The survivors are coming back. Only Lieutenant Vinogradov manages to break out into the field with a dozen fighters. But they are surrounded and captured already there. In moments of calm, a meeting of the commanders is held in the citadel. After discussing the situation, they draw up Order No. 1. According to him, Captain Zubashev was appointed commander of the defense, and Famine was appointed commissioner. Verbally, at a meeting, they agree on another breakthrough attempt. On the same day, the Germans decisively attack the citadel. They manage to free the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, who are trapped in the club building, and gain a foothold in the White Palace and the engineering building. There was no connection between the Eastern Fort and the officer's house. In fact, they didn't know about each other's existence at the time. The South Island mine clearance operation has been completed. By June 24, German troops controlled most of the fortress. However, several pockets of resistance still held out. On the 5th day of the battle in the citadel, the forces of Famine's group and Captain Zubashev were melting away before our eyes. After German sappers blew up several sections of the ring barracks, the last 450 defenders of the citadel surrendered and were captured. On the North Island, a group of fighters held out in the casemates of the bakery of the 44th Regiment to the last and surrendered only when they ran out of ammunition. The last stronghold of the defenders of the fortress was the Eastern Fort, which had become the core of the defense by that time. All approaches to it were blocked by targeted machine gun fire. On the eve of the assault, the Deputy Major Gavrilova on the political side, Commissioner Skripnik, voluntarily surrendered to the Germans. He spoke in detail about the size of the garrison and the location of the ammunition depot. The last attack on the Eastern Fort was organized based on his information. At the walls of the fort, the Germans set up a heavy 88mm anti-aircraft gun for the first time. 2 captured tanks were soon brought up. the French Somua and the Soviet T-26. The fire on the embrasures and windows of the fort did not produce any visible results. Trying to turn the situation around, Major General Schlieper requested aviation support. First, the bombers dropped 500-kilogram bombs on the fort. However, only minor damage was caused to the thick walls. It was only when an 1,800 kilograms aerial bomb was dropped that the explosion that shook the entire city. On June 30, the eastern fort fell. Further fighting became almost partisan in nature. Individual soldiers of the defeated garrison held out for several more days and attacked posts in clearing groups. Major Gavrilov and Senior Lieutenant Gregory Derevyanko, having already been seriously wounded, was captured only on July 23, 1941. Finally, the city of Brest and the fortress were cleared only by the middle of August. The Brest Fortress became the first serious obstacle for the Germans and cost them a lot of blood. On June 30, 1941, German losses amounted to about 500 dead and more than 1,000 wounded. The irretrievable losses of the Red Army amounted to about 9,000 people. 2 months after the start of the war, on August 26, 1941, Adolf Hitler and the Italian Duce Benito Mussolini visited the Brest Fortress. This was the Führer's first visit to the Eastern Front. He wanted to see the ruins of the fortress firsthand and show the Duce the giant Karl siege mortars. Personal pilot Hitler Hans Bauer recalled, "Demonstration of the results of the use of heavy German weapons in Brest-Litovsky was supposed to dispel all doubts from Mussolini and influence him on the issue of supporting his ally in the campaign against Moscow." For a more impressive picture, military equipment was brought to the fortress from the immediate vicinity, including heavy artillery, which in fact the defenders of the fortress did not use during the defense. The commander of the Fourth Army, Field Marshal, acted as a guide. Gunther von Kluge, whose divisions directly took the city and the fortress. After inspecting the wrecked captured equipment, Hitler was in a great mood. But he hardly realized then that the defense of the Brest Fortress was the beginning of not only the war with Soviet Union, but also the beginning of the end of his invincible army.